All right, everyone. This is the Bearded Music Teacher, also known as Mr. E, and this is the Bearded Music Teacher podcast. It's been a while. I've been a little busy with the holiday break. I'm back and ready to go, and we're going to pick up right where we left off. But remember, this podcast is for educational purposes. None of this information, this is stuff that I've learned through various research, various articles, various other means. So that way you guys can go and check it on your own. A lot of my research has been focused from John Kovach, which is from the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. So we're going to start the episode is Beatlemania Part 2. Beatlemania is a massive, massive thing that really you can really track it all the way up to their White Album, also known as the Beatles, where they kind of start to go into psychedelia. I mean, really, at that point, after Norwegian Wood, they kind of settled down a little bit. But the big peak of Beatlemania happens from 63 to 66. So they began the year by recording and touring in support of their first album called Please Please Me. By August of that year, they had 3 more hit singles in the UK, which is Please Please Me, which charted at number 1, From Me to You, which charted at the number 1 spot, and then She Loves You, which is also number 1. These are all in the UK charts. Then the breakthrough in Britain occurred mid-October, and that occurred when they performed at the London Palladium. Some of you guys may not know what that is. The London Palladium is a kind of like at that point, it was viewed as like the stepping stone into the Ed Sullivan Show, which is where the Beatles ultimately wanted to end up. So this London Palladium was that performance was similar to the Ed Sullivan Show, but if you want to think of it this way, it's the British or UK version of that particular show. So very similar to Ed Sullivan's show at the time, Toast of the Town, which was a national broadcast that was really the one that helped drive pop culture at the time. So by late November, they had their second album, which is With the Beatles, and they entered the UK charts at number 2. But it was well on its way to the top spot, which actually held until the next year, April of 64. In December, I Want to Hold Your Hand hit number 1 in the UK chart, where it replaced She Loves You and became the band's 4th consecutive hit. This really cements the dominance that the Beatles had in the UK in that year of 63. That really was the reason why Capitol should have signed them earlier. I could go into a lot of things that they should have done. But Capitol was reluctant to sign the Beatles because they were sure, or to release stuff to the United States. Now, Capitol is the EMI, so they're currently under EMI at this time. So EMI and Capitol are really the same company. It's just one's in the UK, one's in the United States. Capitol is in the West Coast of the United States. It actually housed the Beach Boys, which when we get to the American response after Beatlemania, we'll see that there's some healthy conflict going on between the two.
Teachers, you may begin testing.
Sorry about that disruption. So when we think about this, the Capitol was really reluctant because based on their experience, if you look back in music history with Capitol, they had Cliff Richard, who was really big in Britain. It was like the most British artist and pop artist that you could find in Britain. He failed to really establish himself as a consistent hit maker in the United States. In fact, the Beatles were so afraid of failing in America that they told Brian Epstein that they didn't want to go to the U.S. until they had a number 1 hit there. So they were even reluctant because they didn't want to be like the Cliff Richard at the time. And not to take away anything from Cliff Richard. Cliff Richards is a great pop artist. He did some phenomenal hits, not the focus of this podcast episode, but certainly is someone that if you look at British pop culture, that's the one really hits throughout the 50s. So 1950 to really 1960 is when he was there. 1962, 1963 also. But anyways, so they finally, Brian Epstein really worked out the way to get onto the Ed Sullivan Show, and this occurred in February of '64. Sullivan had agreed that the Beatles would get the top billing on the show, so Epstein and Martin were able to convince Capitol to release "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in late '63. Now, this is important because, again, Capitol was really reluctant to release those. They were like, we have them. And that's why you also see there's a couple singles out there by VJ as well. VJ was another record label that had masters. So you'll actually see, if you look at some Beatles catalogs, you'll actually see a couple other small labels that have released Beatles stuff because they did have that. And then they went and got it up by Capitol and then they released it. But they needed to release "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in '63 because 2 months later, they were going to perform that song on the Ed Sullivan Show. So they released it under Capitol, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." It shot up the charts. It just went pew, right through the top of the charts, and that hit number one by the appearance, and that really set it off, was the appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. That what's really broke it wide open. So then that was where it just totally snowballed into something huge. They constantly toured. They constantly performed. If you look at, just type in Beatlemania into any YouTube or Google, and you'll see all these videos of how massively popular and this absolute pandemonium that was going on around the Beatles. It was absolutely astonishing. You really didn't have that. I mean, you did to a point with like Elvis. Elvis was pretty popular, but this was a new level. This was bigger than Elvis. So in July of 1964, the band actually released their first feature film. And between that, they had "Can't Buy Me Love," which was a hit, "A Hard Day's Night." After "A Hard Day's Night" was released as movie and as as a single. "Ticket to Ride" in '65, "Help" in '65, and "Paperback Writer" in '66. These are all huge things that, when you look at them, actually, like "Help," there's a couple articles about "Help" and some research that we've done, and you can actually see this a lot when we talk about Beatles throughout the podcasts. Paul McCartney, if I remember right, "Help" is a Paul song that Paul wrote, and it really is I think it is. But anyways, it was, whether it was John or Paul, it was really them. You could make the case that they were trying to call for help, but done in a slightly comical way. They had a thing about words, and they had a thing about being very hidden with what their meanings were. But at that time in 1965, they were really going hard on their touring, on their performing. It was getting really hard on them. They were in deep. They were in deep. They were the band in the United States and really around the world. And so I think "Help," in my opinion, "Help" was one of those songs that was like, hey, look, we're going to write this, but really it's our call to help. It's our call that we need help because we're really in it really hard. Now, in 1966, things turned sour for the band when controversy erupted in the United States. Again, we can talk about Beatlemania throughout the UK and around the world, but the focus here is really the United States. And so in 1966, John, in an interview, John Lennon, made a comment that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. Now, there was some things that were lost in translation, obviously, from what he later came out with. He didn't really mean anything by it. At least that's what he said as a public apology later on, is that he really was like, look, he was asked about the role religion played in the lives of the Beatles' youth, and John Lennon replied that Christianity will go on, and that the British society, the Beatles were more popular at the time. And so it kind of got lost a little bit. It caused a lot of um, issues. There's a lot of backlash. There's a lot of people that were very religious in the United States that would go and try to shut down the concerts. There were people that would burn records of the Beatles because, again, they thought he was talking about bad about the religion of Christianity. And so there's a bit of a backlash, and really we see that kind of things kind of go a little bit. The band kind of goes a little bit into a reclusive state in 1966. And really at that time, 1966, we start to see psychedelia start to kind of creep its way in, and the culture around that kind of creep in as well. So it's not surprising that that's the case. But to kind of finish up a little bit, now, again, we can talk about Beatlemania being, and we're going to kind of advance through all these, about how they kind of look at Beatlemania goes all the way through really until 66. But there's stuff that happens around there that really need to be focused on. For example, John Lennon and Paul McCartney start to really take the reins as the songwriting team. And we have a couple songs by George Harrison, especially in the later albums, especially toward the end, the near psychedelia era, White Album, Magical Mystery Tour. I think he has a song. I think George has a song on Norwegian Wood. But they start to really write songs and really take the songs that were from their early Quarrymen days and kind of rework them a little bit. And after 1966, when we get like the album Help and Norwegian Wood, like I said, they start to really push from what we call the craftsman model to the artist model. What I mean by that is the craftsman model is, okay, we have this formula that works, we do it over and over again, we just kind of become this factory of songs where we just spit out the songs one after another after another. Well, when we start getting toward Norwegian Wood and in the mid to late 60s, we start to expand on that. We start to really look at different ways we can interpret music, different forms. We have found material that we maybe have found from a book that John Lennon reads. Protest songs, things like that. The more expansive and experimental side of things. George Harrison picks up a sitar, which is an Indian, an instrument out of India. But John Lennon actually confesses that he lost his confidence and needed to be reassured. Looking back at his youth when he was naive and provided self-confidence that the maturity has stripped away. He was really starting to come into his own as a artist, not as a musician. Up until this point, up until 1966, really could be said that these four, Ringo, George, John, and Paul, were really musicians. They weren't artists. They started really forming as artists later on. Like Eleanor Rigby comes up in the later portions of their careers as the Beatles, and that paints a dark picture of alienation, and perhaps influenced by one of the German students that they befriended during their time in Hamburg. So they kind of look back at stuff, but they kind of are reflective, but then they also have that interesting kind of take on things they can be deemed experimental. And then they also bump into Bob Dylan in 1964, and they really were challenged by Bob Dylan, at least Lennon and McCartney, to move past the teenage love songs. So we have that kind of change in their maturity, change in their stuff. And what do we see after the Beatles invade? Well, this is the next thing. I actually go through all this stuff with my classes, which if you're watching the video, I just click through all of the videos that we usually see in the classroom that I have found through various sites. And so what happens after the Beatles invade? Then this is where we're going to kind of wrap up, and we'll talk about each artist individually or each band. So if you can imagine the floodgates of a river, when there's a hard storm and it bursts. It breaks. That's what happened with Beatlemania. After we saw that, record labels really, when the Beatles hit huge, everything that was in competition with Capitol wanted to have another British band. So the Rolling Stones pop in, and they become the number 2 band, if not the number 1 band, right along there with the Beatles. You had the Beatles, Beach Boys, and Rolling Stones. There were 3 huge bands at that time. Then you have Gary and the Pacemakers. You have the Dave Clark Five. You have the Animals and the Yardbirds, the Hollies. The list goes on and on and on. And these all were bands from the United Kingdom. They were British bands, and they were the ones that were in the top groups. Herman Hermits was also one of them. It just popped into my head. So these bands were British bands that the U.S. picked up and was like, hey, how's it going? And of course, out of the Yardbirds comes Led Zeppelin, which is another huge band. But anyways, we'll leave it right there with the end of that. This is just a brief part of Beatlemania. There's massive amounts of things that we could talk about with Beatlemania, but for the purposes of my class, we kind of look more at the performances and the culture, which we can't show here on this podcast, obviously due to copyright issues. But keep in mind, you can always watch previous episodes, share the episodes with your friends, colleagues, share them in your classroom if you're a music teacher like myself. Feel free to do that. Feel free to reach out to me. You can follow me on Twitter at MR_E_musicFCS. That's my professional Twitter. That's where I post all things music related. Please make sure again that you share this podcast. And until next time, which we'll be talking about the individual bands after the Beatles, I'll just see you then. So we'll talk about that, and then we will hopefully then move on to the American response with Stax and Motown. So thank you for viewing this podcast, and I will see you next time.